One of the popular questions often directed at the Quran is, why does God refer to himself in the masculine? The lack of any proper direct answers to the question has led some to doubt the reality of its authorship, using God's masculine self-reference to say that the writer or writers had been male. For why should God not refer to himself in the feminine? This essay aims to give a conclusive answer to the above. As noted in the previous video, the language of the Quran is not the language that's used today. Its words don't refer to things as concrete, specific things like wall, door, man, etc., but rather to motions, relations, and forces. It's dynamic. When we see a dog, we automatically associate it with the single-syllable term dog. We do this purely out of habit. We don't know why such an animal is even called that. Why those 3 letters? Why this number of syllables? What is dog in itself, and why should it be related to the sound that we have for it? These are precisely the sorts of questions to which the language of the Quran provides a solution. It looks not at a dog's features and recognizes it in association with the conventional term dog like we do, but rather it looks at its telos, what defines it the most, the thing that's most typical about this animal, and not its looks, but its eidos, the most universal habit and behavioral attribute that defines this particular species. We observe all that which falls under the genus dog, and deduce from our observation the most thing they have in common, before they begin to diverge and speciate. And even where they have so widely diverged and speciated that they don't seem to be related, the same general structure and plan of being will always be visible in them. This habit, this plan, is a pattern, much like a law or an equation, a motif or engram, a whole of parts connected to each other according to a fixed logical rule, and, once procured, the pattern to which all species that fall under the genus dog adhere. We can look more closely at this pattern and deconstruct it. In so doing, we'll find that it's a sequence, a rhythm, an equation, almost like a graphics interchange format replaying the behavioral pattern that's most common and unique to all specimens of this genus. The pattern is much like DNA, but metaphysical in nature, containing a serial order made of logical steps. Each step is like a frame in an image whose analog in speech is a syllable. I must know beforehand the animate principle which each syllable represents, and the syllable must in turn reflect and animate the equivalent step, such that once joined together in the sequence in which they occur to us in experience, as the impression dog, we have a word, but a word that's a monogram of principles reflecting and replaying precisely the notion to which it refers. Here, dog is not just the word that invokes an image of a 4-legged being that pants a lot, but rather I see the phenomenological process or principle which any given dog merely embodies, and which upon seeing a dog my mind automatically plays. The words of the Quran all have this inductive feature, as evidenced by the method discussed in a previous video by which to understand the words of the Quran as well as their syllabic composition, i.e. the letters. To briefly recap, understanding a Quranic word is analogous to a scientific experiment. Both utilize a method known as induction. By choosing a word and looking at all the cases in which it's used in the Quran, by studying the various contexts in which the same word is found, and asking myself, having assembled all the cases, what they all have in common, and observing how each case of use impacts the overall meaning of the sentence, I arrive at the principle and meaning by inductively going from the specific cases of use to the overall general sense. Precisely here that the literary genius of the Quran shows. In its very structure is inscribed instructions on how to understand it. The frequency with which a particular word is used reflects its general sense. But what enables me to understand it is not just the frequency, but the diversity of use. The more different and diverse are the contexts and cases in which a word is used, the clearer the meaning of said word. This is what lawyers and judges naturally do and is a central principle in legal reasoning. Having inductively grasped a certain law, a lawyer can see in a wide range of cases and scenarios all previous or possible infringements on it, and is qualified on this basis to act as an advisor. Each case of a word's use is a logical step that's necessarily connected to the next. In fact, it implies it or presupposes it, in the same way that a chair implies or suggests a seated human body, that shoes imply feet, that a dark cloud suggests rain. The same line of reasoning applies to the question of gender. We move beyond the sphere of biology, just as we did with dog, to the principles. Whereas before I would have seen shapes and colors and tones, I now see motions, relations, sequences, and animations. Why should the word remind be the same word used to mean male in Arabic? This is answered by contemplating what the two contexts, male and remind, have in common. What's male-like about reminiscence, and what's reminiscent about maleness or masculinity? After looking at the various cases of use in the Quran, we see that there is a reproductive sense in reminiscence and a recapitulatory feature in masculinity. That, when reminded of something, we don't just remember the event, but all the associations and connotations, the memories that accompany the event. The key word here is content. The memory is a surrogate for all sorts of content, each of which is pregnant with other content. The same function is served when a particular thought immediately evokes its connotations. My ambulation from one memory to the next shows the principle which I, in such instances, personify. For instance, the idea of computer evokes the ideas of keyboard, processor, RAM, screen, pad, etc., in the sense that these are deducible from it. Alternatively, the idea of keyboard itself implies the rest just as computer does. By the same token, male is a reproductive agent, and in reproduction the male adds nothing new, in the sense that he doesn't create, but he recreates, discharging a genome containing his entire ancestral line. And in a sense, he regenerates that of which he himself is a product. This is precisely the reasoning that dictated that the two contextually and in a sense widely different concepts of male and reminiscence should share the same word, dhakar. As regards gender, the first proposition to be made here is that gender pronoun use in Arabic does not strictly refer to the biological male and female, but to a certain dialectical relation which subsists between the two reproductive principles. For example, in Arabic, typically female gender pronouns and suffixes such as ta are freely used by males, particularly in the first person, as in the case of Joseph, who uses the expression I saw, ra'aytu, that contains the suffix ta in reference to a vision that he saw. We have here a male agent deploying what appears to be a feminine morpheme. Whether the subject is male or female, it will be found that the same morpheme ending with the feminine ta is used. Contrast this with the third-person reference, he saw, ra'a, pretty much the same word as used by Joseph, only we find it lacking the suffix ta. Here the masculine identity of the referent is revealed, where it was obscured in the former case. Interestingly, it's revealed only when we've exited the sphere of subjectivity, and where the object of reference of our deictic projection is other than myself, i.e., out there, in contradistinction to myself. Here a very important rule is shown that's often taken for granted, and which we'll find to be very decisive in understanding the linguisticality of gender dynamics. Whereas on the surface two modes of reference appear to exist, that is, self-reference, I, and external reference, he, she, they, etc., there's actually only one mode of reference, and that's the external, since self-reference itself is external, since I must refer to myself in distinction to my act of self-reference. I here is a reference to a past self. I must, so to speak, transcend myself in order to refer to myself. The self, the deictic center from which emanate those acts of reference, of judgment, is permanently hidden from itself, is elusive to itself. The only way of capturing the self without confusing it with one of its past acts is to approach it as a continuum, a substance, by having it be the norm and its individual acts as the exceptions. For example, in writing an essay, each act, each word, sentence, or paragraph is an instance of the larger program of writing an essay. My relation to the essay is infinite, in that it's marked by continuous reproducibility or reproduction. The words, sentences, ideas are simply their offspring. In interpersonal dialogue, our verbal exchange takes place under the condition of coextension or isomorphism, of the formal connection between myself and my interlocutor. This relation is always established before any specific remarks can be made. You'll find this relation everywhere. In telecommunication, a point-to-point connection is required before any transmission of content is possible. The connection is prior to communication. Thus, you share with your own self a relation very much identical. You are continuous with yourself. We find in the Quran that the same relation of parity figures between the celestial principles. The sun and moon, day and night, the heavens and earth are related to each other as you are with your own self. That is, the sun and moon are not two different things, that is, two different genuses, but are one principle divided for functional and reproductive purposes, which is why their communion in the Quran is an eschatological event, because by uniting them we neutralize the reproductive agency contained in their division. Their union symbolizes that the universe can admit of no more growth and life. The sun is not supposed to encroach upon the moon, nor can the day outrun the night. Here is expressed the formal unity of the celestial principles. The moon is as different from the sun as you are from your own self, in the sense that your self-consciousness is the offspring event of a formal and continuous relation shared between you and yourself. It's in this scheme that gender dynamics, as pertains to language, is held. Consider the lack of distinction which Arabic exercises between the collective and feminine pronouns. In the Quran and in general Arabic, self-reference, the collective and female reference, all share the same feminine morpheme, occurring either as a suffix or a prefix. The third case of reference spans the collective. We find here a distinction that's lacking in English, that there are two modes of referring to the collective depending on the case. A group of females will always bear the feminine morpheme ta or noon, whereas a group of males will always bear a masculine morpheme waw. In Arabic, the plural and individual often share the same word, without any inflection, addition, or omission of morphemes. The same goes for the masculine individual and plural. This is because in such instances, the plural, however numerous are its members, counts as one unit, because it's not the number of individuals that really counts, but rather that the group has something in common that renders them one. In English, we find the general reference they to cover both, which, by the way, is also the case with the Arabic collective masculine morpheme waw, only that Arabic supplements that with a more case-specific determination. In other words, the masculine collective pronoun can include both male and female participants, whereas a female collective pronoun can only host female participants. This discrepancy can only be solved by placing language in the sphere of metaphysics, by recognizing that the male is, like dhakar, a creative and poetic principle. Any relation in which I am the forerunner, in which I am the invoker, or the author counts me as the masculine. If in a particular interaction I am the conversation starter, the dictator, the person that's on the receiving end of my dictation or elicitation is technically the feminine, and I, the masculine. Thus, besides its formal sense, it is an interactive or situational designation. An example of this is found in the Quran with God, which, being the author of the universe, the progenitor must always, out of logical necessity, refer to himself in the masculine. At the same time, where the situation logically demands it, he will refer to himself in the feminine, noon, the same morpheme used in reference to an active group of females. On a closer look, we see that the morpheme is specifically used in reaction to acts, or to annotate a formal, masculine act. For example, the collective term ending with noon, like muhsinin, mu'minin, mushrikeen, etc., are typically used to summarize and denominate certain phenomena, as if they're employed, as they are, to signal the completion of a cycle. Contrast this with the earlier morpheme ta, which appears to indicate contemporaneity or simultaneity, طلعت, أخذت, etc., or in prefix form, تقول, تمن, تجد. We see here that an act is contemporary or concurrent with another, suggesting, in contradistinction to noon, not the completion of a phase or the persistence of a completed phase in time, but of the occurrence of an act in parallel to another. The sun rises, تطلع, is an event in which the sun and those upon whom it shines are momentarily synchronized. Furthermore, each phase, act, or phenomenon, such as simultaneity or conclusivity, is itself divisible into masculine and feminine poles. For example, simultaneity is divisible into the act itself and the immediate reaction it invokes. For example, writing an essay occurs to us as a single, indivisible act, but here we're in fact tuned into the end of a process whose beginnings are very discrete and can only be known in retrospect. The writing is an act which I momentarily conduct, but it's also the simultaneous act of the essay upon me, its writer. At this level of abstraction, we confront the palindromic, or refractive nature of all activities. As Alexander explains, the reaction begins at the same moment as the action, and two bodies in reciprocal action are simultaneous so far as concerns this moment. Thus, the reciprocal attraction of the earth and the falling stone is a single transaction which is the beginning of the two opposite movements of the earth to the stone and the stone to the earth. We understand by this that the use of the morpheme ta, in such cases as the above, presupposes awareness of the concurrent nature of the two distinct but really unified acts. Thus, in the original male-female schema, the morpheme ta would fall upon the female, so as to indicate her reciprocal role in a scheme in which she is not the progenitor. The pronoun does not discriminate and has nothing to do with gender as such, but with logic, with vocation, or the genesis of processes, their stages, and where the agents of said processes lay in the spectrum. The logically masculine role can freely be assumed by a female, and the logically feminine role by a male. Though the different gender condition modes of reference must remain unchanged, a logically masculine feminine agent retains her feminine reference code, so as to always imply her former relation to the male, who, in this invariant dynamic, is the original of the two.